Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Skullgirls for PC, Mac, Linux, Android, iOS, PlayStation 3, PlayStation 4, PS Vita, Xbox 360, and Arcade. What you're seeing here is the PC version. This is a 2D fighting game that's had a bit of a weird development history because it was originally developed by Reverge Labs, which eventually reorganized into Lab Zero Games. And it was originally co-published by Autumn Games and Konami, but eventually Autumn Games and Konami went their separate ways, and now it's Autumn Games alone that publishes it. It's kind of an odd situation. But anyway, the original version of the game was released in 2012 for PSN and XBLA, and the PC version wouldn't come out until the following year. The Encore version, which is basically an improved version of the game that they were working on after they severed ties with Konami, was released for PSN and XBLA in 2014, and finally we got Second Encore, which is the new and improved version that's basically got all of the characters in it without having to actually buy them separately as DLCs, and that was released first in 2015 for PS4 and for arcades, of course, and also for PS Vita, PC, Mac, and Linux this year. So it's kind of an odd situation there. The point is that if you pick up Skullgirls at this point, you're pretty much going to get Second Encore, and I technically don't have that, even though when I actually look in the menu, it actually says Second Encore. Because what Second Encore brings to the table is fully voiced story mode. It brings in a new character, Robo Fortune, at least if you haven't picked her up already. It has some challenges and trials, a survival mode, and a bunch of stuff for the PlayStation platforms that I obviously can't access. Now, if I wanted to, I could upgrade to Second Encore. It is available as a DLC for the PC version, but if you are wanting to get Second Encore, then you're probably going to be getting it on PS4 or PS Vita, and those are the versions that are only Second Encore. So otherwise, you might have to upgrade if you want all of the content of Second Encore. I just haven't done that, so I can't really speak for its value. What I can do, however, is assess the game in and of itself. I may not be able to assess the specifically Second Encore content, but I can definitely take a look at the game in its main state, which is just the Encore version. And that's precisely what I'm going to do, so let's get started. Now, as far as the presentation goes, that's one thing they absolutely excel at. This thing has an absolutely fantastic art style with a bunch of hand-drawn artwork that looks great. All of the animations look fantastic, all of the characters have their own unique styles, and it really does look very unique in a sea of fighting games. And one of the big things about that art style that is unique, beyond simply the extremely high quality of the art itself, is this rather interesting 40s aesthetic where everything is made up to look like, say, a Broadway show or a film. And that definitely goes a long way to giving it quite a lot of charm. In fact, about the only thing that's really negative about the visuals is that the cutscenes are not fully animated. They're really more like slideshows, and that's okay, but it's a bit disappointing when the artwork is that good that it's not animated fully in the cutscenes. But other than that, everything looks pretty fantastic, and when you go over to the sound design, that pretty much continues. The voice acting is very well done, although I haven't experienced it in the story mode. In the actual fights themselves, the characters are well voiced. They have their own personalities that are obvious through their voice acting, not just through their character designs. And it definitely helps the game out quite a bit in the long run. There's also the music, which is a variety of sort of pop influences, but also some definite influences from the 1940s. And it's both a pretty unique soundtrack in terms of fighting games, and it's incredibly catchy. Which is actually saying something, considering I really don't like 1940s music very much, unless it's a bunch of saxophone music that's inspired by noir. And that's really more from the 30s than the 40s. I guess it's lucky for me then that it actually does have a bit of noir-inspired music in there. So they did a great job with the soundtrack, and they did a great job with the voice acting. The only thing that's slightly weaker in the sound design is the sound effects, which I would describe as just average. None of them are particularly great, but they definitely do their job, and they do it well enough. But of course, as great as the presentation is, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is set in a sort of fictionalized 1940s setting known as the Canopy Kingdom, and there's a bunch of people vying for control of something known as the Skull Heart. It's an artifact that grants one woman's wish every 7 years. and if an impure soul manages to use the heart, then the wish is corrupted and she gets transformed into a monster known as the Skullgirl. So, obviously, with regards to what you're doing in the game, you're playing as one of the various characters in their quest to do something about the Skull Heart. Everyone has their own reasons for going after it, and as you play through the story mode, which is basically just if you took an arcade ladder and you put in a bunch of cutscenes in between the matches, then you'd find that every single character has their own progression, their own characters they interact with, and it's a decent enough story mode, but it feels a bit bare bones, particularly when you compare it to something like, say, Mortal Kombat 9. But it does help to fill in some of the backstory, and it helps to flesh out the characters a bit more, so it's definitely appreciated that that's a thing, rather than simply a one-off mode that's really not given any attention at all. Don't get me wrong, in the grand scheme of story modes in fighting games, this is really one of the more average ones, but it definitely could have been a lot worse, let's put it that way. Now, as I said, each character has their own motivations, their own personality, and it is pretty cool to see that unfold as you go through the story mode, but even a lot of that is actually just evident from playing the game itself, which is of course pretty much what you would expect. Now here's the rub. The original release of the game only had 8 playable characters, and then there was an Indiegogo campaign to finance basically the DLCs for it, which introduced Squiggly, Big Band, Eliza, Beowulf, and Robo-Fortune. Of those, I have all of them except Robo-Fortune. And there's also another character called Fukua, which is basically just a palette swap of Philia. She's one of the original characters that came with the game. And oddly enough, it was actually originally an April Fool's joke that fan responses were so positive to that they just straight up put it into the game permanently. But of course that means that if you don't get the DLCs, which when they released the DLC characters, they were actually free for about a week after they were released, and so you could actually go in and pick up the DLC for free and get that character without having to pay for it, so that was kind of cool. But the point is that the roster is rather small unless you own all the DLC characters, which is kind of problematic because this is really meant more as a tag team game than a full-on normal fighting game. Now, there's a couple of issues with that. First, the low roster of characters means that you're really not going to get a huge amount of variety with the tag team stuff. Second, tag team in the fighting game scene is actually fairly niche, which of course means that Skullgirls limits its audience a bit from that, and then it also limits it even further by nature of being a 6-button fighting game that is extremely heavy on combos. And that presents a big problem for me because combos are really not one of my strong suits. Obviously your mileage may vary on that, but whenever I have to keep up a long combo to be able to do a lot of damage, it just is never a good time. This of course means that it's rather difficult for me to really be able to get into a combo-heavy fighting game. That said, Skullgirls definitely tries its best to make the transition a bit easier. It has a very comprehensive tutorial system that's actually pretty much the best I've ever seen in a fighting game. Not only does it take you through the basic controls and some basic combos, but it really gives you an appreciation for the finer aspects of a fighting game, particularly one of this style. And thus the tutorial ends up being an absolutely fantastic introduction to particularly this style of fighting game, but even to other fighting games in general. Most of the concepts you learn from the tutorials in Skullgirls can be applied to other fighting games, and thus this is oddly enough, despite being a relatively niche game in and of itself, a fantastic introduction to the fighting game genre as a whole. Which I know sounds like a really odd contradiction, but when you actually go through the tutorials, that makes sense, because you've got everything from the sheer basics that an absolute beginner's gonna need, straight up to the more expert tutorials that people who have been playing fighting games for a long time will appreciate more. Because those get more into the technical aspects of the fighting engine that you're dealing with here, which is a fairly basic 6-button fighting game. You have your light, medium, and heavy attacks, and that of course applies for both punches and kicks. Each character also has their own array of moves, including a fairly large degree of special moves, some of which are more useful than others, and some of which require more finesse than others, but all of which give each character a unique feel. Now, I'm not particularly good with most of them. The ones I tend to play the most are Philia and Eliza, but other than that, I'm just kind of a crapshoot as to what I'm able to do. And I'm sure that's coming across in the footage you're seeing here, because I'm really not very good at this style of fighting game at all. I've never been particularly good at the 6-button fighters, especially when they're as heavy on combos as Skullgirls is. So your mileage may vary on how successful you are and how successful you are with each individual character, but one thing is for sure, every single one of them has a definitely unique feel, including the one that's actually a mimic of other characters, which is actually fairly interesting. And even when you start delving into the actual fighting mechanics themselves, the core gameplay beyond simply the aesthetics, beyond simply the character designs and things like that, you end up finding that the mechanics themselves are rock solid. Whether or not you particularly like combo-heavy fighting games, you'll find that the controls in this are intuitive and they are extremely responsive, making the combat feel pretty fast and frenetic. There's not really any point in the game where you're ever going to feel like the controls are getting in your way so much as it's your own lack of skill getting in your way. And of course it does have a fairly high skill ceiling, so you will run into people online if you do decide to play online who will completely curb stomp you. Now of course that's really any fighting game, but it's especially true in something like this. Now, what limited experience I do have playing online, because let's face it, I'm not very good at this game, so I'm not really going to play it online very much. But anyway, the limited experience I do have playing online told me that the netcode is actually fairly solid for a fighting game. It's not amazing, but they did a pretty good job with it, and generally speaking, the online is definitely very playable. Obviously, you're still going to get the most out of the local versus, but it's still definitely able to be played online. Just be prepared for some lag issues. But apart from that and a few balancing issues that they've mostly sorted out, although let's face it, the final boss of this game is still a bit BS, there's really not all that much I can actually complain about in Skullgirls. It's just that it's not really my kind of fighting game per se. It's not to say that I didn't enjoy it, I definitely did. It's a very solid fighting game that I can very easily recommend. It's just that combo-heavy fighting games and tag team really aren't my kind of fighting game. The thing is that even if you really aren't into this particular style of fighting game, you might still be able to get something out of it, particularly if you're a newbie to fighting games. Because especially if you're new to fighting games in general, it has some very comprehensive tutorials, and it's also a fairly good introduction to this particular style of fighting game, both tag team and of course combo heavy, because it is very easy to pick up and play, despite having a rather high skill ceiling. And everything it does to set itself apart from other fighting games on the market actually does make up for the fact that the core fighting mechanics themselves are actually fairly standard. They're very well done, don't get me wrong, but there's really not all that much that's special about the core fighting game mechanics. It's really the package that those come in that makes this what it is, and oddly enough, that's plenty. Because it is an extremely solid fighting game, and it's pretty unique in the grand scheme of things. So it is ultimately extremely easy to recommend. I give it a 4 out of 5. Thanks for watching.